In terms of formally opening things today, thank you very much, everyone, for taking the time for the check-in. I think we've got a couple of items on the agenda today. Both, I think, will move us forward on the projects, but you know, if we do finish ahead of time today, then you get the time back. So there's an incentive there, but not to constrain discussion, because I think there's a couple of you know, there's some important points that we want to cover. So I think with that, Ross, unless there's anything else we need to cover formally before we head into the session today, I think probably it's over to you then in terms of reporting sustainability program information.
Great, thanks, Ian. Nothing else formally, so with that, I'll just get my screen ready here and share it, and then we'll get going. Great. Can everybody see my screen?
Looks good, Ross.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm going to start today by just a little bit of a project overview, just to remind members what we're doing with this project, what we've done so far, and kind of to frame it before we get into the discussions today. So I'll go through a few points here today, and then I'll pause for any questions, and then we'll move through the substantive paper 1.2.2. So firstly, just to remind everyone, this is a limited scope project reporting sustainability program information. This came about initially from discussions with the OECD and their Green Budget Collaborative group. And, you know, when we talked to them about their developing green budget principles, looked and felt a lot like our RPG3, the model they were developing for budgeting. And as we've talked about going on a couple of years now, there's been a strong view on the staff and IPSASB side that the RPGs were already applicable for sustainability, but we weren't necessarily hearing back from us that others were seeing it that way. So a need to maybe better communicate to the world that these reporting guidelines are already there and available for sustainability reporting. And you'll recall, if we go back to the staff Q&A on climate change that we did back in 2020, that was one of the points of emphasis in that document when we developed it. But coming out of the mid-period work program consultation, the feedback we got from stakeholders, it was clear that sustainability was a high priority for our stakeholders, and there was a push through those comment letters that we consider how we're going to take that forward. And as the board will remember, back in March when they took decisions, there were 2 projects related to sustainability that were added. So the project we're talking about today, the limited scope project on reporting sustainability program information, and then there's the CP that we put out in May on whether we would take a bigger step into the sustainability space and start a reporting stream, standard setting stream on that. So in June, in the CAG meeting, we brought a few slides into discussion with the CAG on this project and what we were planning to do at the high level. So the approach to the project, we shared with them a few of the implementation guidance questions we were thinking of asking. And in your set of papers, you'll see at the very back, I've diarized the minutes from the feedback from CAG members there and put in some staff views on how we intend to handle those, including changes we've already started to make to the exposure draft that's being developed by me. But stepping back, it was quite strong and positive CAG advice we received from the CAG on taking forward the project, noting that the approach itself was sensible to enhance the current guidance, practical as it relates to reporting outputs and outcomes, and useful that it makes reporting information useful for other purposes, principally budget and policy decisions. And you'll also recall that during my program technical director report in June, I also gave a quick overview in that session to the board on this project, including putting the ideas we had initially on the implementation guidance questions up on the slides and kind of walking them through the board members to get some feedback. which I've taken into account in the document we'll talk about after this slide. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen there and see if there are any initial questions on the project, the overview, before moving into paper 1.2.2. Ian, over to you.
Thanks, Ross. I think that was a very helpful introduction and reminder of, if you like, how we've got to where we are. Just wanted to, as you say, pause and check whether there are any sort of high-level comments from members before we actually start to move into the material. So I'm not seeing any hands raised, Ross. So if you want to move us into the next slide.
Great, thank you. So moving to paper 1.2.2, there's the recommendations are in the paper, and I won't go through all the details in the paper, but there are 4 points related to those recommendations that I thought it would be useful to stop on and have discussions with the members. So the first point I'd like to go through here is the first recommendation in the paper that's about whether or not we should expose these amendments. And the arguments are in the paper, but what it really comes down to is due process is meant to be applied in promulgating IPSAS and the development of IPSAS, and really applies to the development of the authoritative portion of the standards that we develop, so the core text. You may recall in March, we had discussions about the IPSAS themselves and the authoritative portions and the non-authoritative portions. But it's clear that the non-authoritative parts of the standards are not part of the standard. In each part of those guidance, it'll say that. So we did have a discussion within the staff and kind of back and forth thinking about the need to expose, but ultimately we landed on a proposal that we should expose the pronouncement, or sorry, the amendments to the pronouncements, even though it relates only to the non-authoritative portions and the RPGs themselves are not IPSAS. We still thought it was good to enhance the visibility of this work that we're doing in the project, as well as to get input from stakeholders that we can take into account in finalizing the final amendments. And we do have precedent for exposing things that are not IPSAS. The RPGs themselves, when they're developed, we went through an exposure process. The conceptual framework, which isn't an IPSAS and isn't authoritative, is also something that we continue to expose. So with that, the proposal is that that we do expose the amendments and that it be exposed for 60 days. And sorry, I'm kind of jumping around on my points here, but that would be the first one I'd like to start with, if that's okay.
Okay, thanks, Ross, for the introduction there. And I think that, you know, the point you made around sort of both marrying due process but visibility is clearly important. The other factor probably that would influence the 60-day rather than a 4-month is also the perceptions of needing to make progress with this and so on. So I think that's probably the one other factor that maybe just add in. So just really check whether anybody sort of objects to that proposal in terms of how we deal with this. Lucy.
Thank you very much, Chair. I actually, my comment actually is on the second sentence in paragraph 8A, that due process did not be applied in the development of the RPGs. I checked the June 2016 version of the IPSASB due process and working procedures, and indeed, it did not discuss about public exposures of RPGs. It only discusses the public exposure of SAS. however, in the June 2016 version of our due process and working procedures, it speaks about whenever there is a revision in the strategy and work plan, then there is particularly in the project identification and prioritization component of the due process. It actually speaks about discussing this with the PIC. And I think this has been observed in this project as evidenced by the mid-period work program consultation that we did in July of 2021. And then we reviewed the comments and we included this project in the work program. And it has to be, this is the statement in the second sentence of paragraph 8.a is also inconsistent with the due process, specifically paragraph 4 that is posted in the IPSASB website, which states that the IPSASB issues exposure drafts of all proposed IPSAS and RPGs for public comment. So I think this has to be clarified, or it has to be qualified further, or maybe the due process that is posted in our website should be updated. If we meant that that RPGs are that, you know, there's the exposure drops of RPGs need not be exposed because, or need not be submitted for public comment, because there are inconsistencies that I noted in the due process. In the due process that we expounded in the website and in paragraph 8.a of the paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. So I'll just take Lindy's comment and then go back to Ross to pick up to respond to both points. Lindy.
Thank you very much. So I was going to make a comment that we probably do need to update our due process documents, especially if we're moving into these broader areas of reporting to cover it. I agree that we should issue it for comment because we did issue these for comment, so it would be important to get responses and inputs on it. I didn't quite understand, so on the 60 days, I didn't quite understand the justification that it's similar to some kind of consequential project. I understand that it's important to get something out. It's a bit difficult to agree to 60 days. We haven't seen the examples and the extent of the examples and what people would have a look at. So I think can agree that we look at a shorter period, but I would rather first see the full document before we decide on the days given. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. Ross, back to you.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Lucy and Lindy, for your comments. So the point on looking at due process is something we will probably need to have a think about if the board decides in advancing sustainability that we're taking forward a work stream on broader sustainability, and we will need to think about how that fits in with our due process and other procedures. So that's a point already on the radar. Lucy, to your point, you're right. There are requirements in due process around additions and changes to the work program that allow consultation or require consultation with the Public Interest Committee. And for this project, this was one of the projects that we did discuss with the Public Interest Committee back in March when we had our annual meeting, as well as in the development of the consultation paper itself. We talked about sustainability more broadly and the importance of that with the Public Interest Committee. So confident that we've appropriately satisfied that portion of due process. Paragraph 8b, as you flagged, is more about the requirements for exposure drafts and that being related to IPSAS. So I think we'll take that point away and think about it further. But what I am hearing is support for exposing it, which was the proposal. So thanks for that. And Lindy, I take your point on the 60 days. I think the point being is we're only amending non-authoritative parts of RPG 1 and 3. We're not changing the model. Therefore, we've seen this more like an improvements project that we're enhancing the guidance that's already there and adding guidance. So I think regardless of the length of examples or implementation guidance, 60 days is an appropriate period, like we always do for improvements or narrow scope amendment projects. We put them out for comment, but we don't let them sit for 4 months. We generally do 60 days, and we could go a little bit longer, but I think 4 months would be a little bit overkill and probably working counter to the point of that we're moving quickly on sustainability and trying to help people out here. So I'll leave it to the board to determine if they want to take that decision now or wait till September as you proposed. But the staff proposal, I think, is that we expose for 60 days.
Okay, thanks, Ross. So I think there is a general, as you said, there is an action that we're going to need to take this forward to resolve the sort of tensions that have been identified. In terms of the exposure, just one thing you said amend. Actually, this is all proposed additional material, so it's not amending anything. It's just adding non-authoritative material. And I think to the point on timing, the proposal is that as it's non-authoritative, that we would approve in September, which would allow publication in October. If we go longer than 60 days, that means that necessarily we're fairly well into the new year, recognising Southern Hemisphere summer holidays and so on. So again, that was sort of a factor that kind of came in. I think your point though, Lindy, is right, that it is actually, if we log that that's the proposal at the moment, and then we take the formal decision in September when the board has got sight of all the material, that probably feels more comfortable. But noting that the sort of proposal at the moment is that because it's additional non-authoritative material to non-authoritative guidance, and the speed at which things are moving, that we should look at 60 days rather than the more normal 4 months. Everyone okay with that? So Ross, move us back to the slide then.
Thanks, Ian. So moving back to the slide, I hope, can everybody see that? Yeah, okay. So in the paper that I've provided 1.2.2, the project approach and proposed non-authoritative additions are covered in paragraphs 11 to 16. And that's the first point on the slide here. And basically what I'm asking here is if the ED that's included in 1.3.1 includes the amendments. Mainly what we're proposing to add is additional implementation guidance to help illustrate how the model applies to green programs. And then other BCs that will develop as the board finalizes its decisions. And in RPG 3, the 4 implementation examples that we're working to develop now based on fact patterns we're working to get from the OECD on a carbon tax, green bond, investments in infrastructure to mitigate the impacts of climate change, and a tax expenditure example. And the tax expenditure example is one we added after input from the CAG. In particular, a CAG member said this is a heavily used program at the moment to incentivize investments in green programs, and that it would be helpful to have an example on that. So our intention is that we'll also develop those examples to be reviewed in September, but the IGs and the answers for both RPG 1 and 3 are in 1.3.1. And the question I'm asking here, the recommendation is, does the members agree that those are the authoritative amendments proposed as to now? And if they're okay with that, and we will we will take comments on the specific drafting, if any substantive points, following the discussion of the recommendations. And I did want to note that I had received comments from Scott Showalter in his absence. Overall, he was happy with the proposed approach on the project, noting that it was in line with what he thought we'd agreed to do, and that the amendment seemed appropriate to help deal with the problem that we had. He did provide some drafting comments related to what was proposed that I'll consider along with any other drafting comments I receive in the run up to September. But I just wanted to make board members aware of that before I moved in the discussion, because Scott's not here to make those points himself. So with that, I'll stop sharing my slide, and we can talk about the proposed additional amendments to RPGs 1 and 3, or additions to 1 or 2 RPG 1 and 3. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the introduction there, Ross, and that outline of the overall proposed approach. I guess at this stage, before we move in to see if there are any substantive comments, just to check then whether there are any comments from members in terms of the overall approach being proposed in terms of additional material for either RPG 1 or RPG 3. Yeah, Camira first, then Todd, and then Lynn.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Ross, for the presentation and the proposals. Well, my expectation was a bit different for this limited scope project. I thought that we would go more and refresh the text itself, not only adding guidance, but also just to take a look at the existing text and try to incorporate the sustainability concepts there. So that was my original expectation. But what I have seen now, okay, it seems really, for me, it's like very limited, extremely limited. So yeah, I had a different expectation. So I just wanted to say that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Camira. And I think again that does emphasise the need to see those examples, but also the light touch approach that when we looked at it, the substantive text, if I call it that, or the core text in both RPGs seemed directly applicable, and that what we needed to do was explain how people could apply that. Todd, to you, and then to Lynn.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and thanks for the presentation, Ross. Probably a little bit like Camira. When I looked at this, I thought, yes, it's good to be clear how this can apply to sort of green programs and the like. I like the fact that in RPG 3, we're going to provide some illustrative examples, because I think the illustrative examples are what's going to help make it come alive for our users. They will actually get a good sense of what we mean by, linking the actual guidance as it's written to green bonds and the like. And I suppose my question is, we've thought about illustrative examples for RPG 3. Was any consideration given to some sort of illustrative example, or something a bit more than just the 3 paragraphs that are suggested, which will help make it come alive a bit more for our constituents? Because I think if we expose this, that could be the sort of feedback that we get from our constituents. It's all very well to have provided these paragraphs, but we need a bit more.
Ross, did you want to come back on that before I go to Lynn?
Yeah, I'll come back quickly, because I guess when we started to think about it, and we did take a good look at RPG 1 and 3 and whether the current reporting models are applicable, and did think about whether there were tweaks that we should consider making, but decided against it because the models themselves are sound for what they're trying to do. There's no flaws, and actually they work quite well with the green programs. The issue we have, and the real problem we have now, is people aren't seeing this guidance as applicable, and they're not applying it. So tinkering with the models isn't going to help with that problem. that might make us feel better that we're making a bigger impact. But from a standard setting perspective, the gap right now is people aren't using it. So I think the key is not to spend a bunch of time re-envisioning a model that people are ignoring. I think the key is to make people aware that these models are here now, and there is a reporting option available that people just aren't choosing to take. That's the problem we're addressing. And I think that's the approach and why we're taking it. So I take your point on the illustrative examples. We did think quite hard on which examples would be more useful. We did consult OECD on this. And we did think about whether we would use illustrative examples in both RPG1 and RPG3. Ultimately landing that RPG3 is the one that makes the bigger difference and is the applicable model. If you do the reporting for a green program in line with RPG3, then when you take it to RPG1, it's really about thinking about the future timing of cash inflows and outflows, and updating your projections for all of your dimensions in your RPG1 model.
So, Todd, I'll go back to you and then carry on round. I mean, what I'm hearing though, I think is we need to think about the communication on this. And so that's probably one of the takeaways, that we need to think about how do we raise the profile of the RPGs as guidance and promote them. And that may be working with other stakeholders as much as with our own guidance. But with that observation, perhaps go back to you, Todd, and then I'll carry on round, because I've got Lynn, then Mike, then Lindy and Renee. So Todd, to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I just wanted to clarify, I wasn't suggesting that we needed to dive into the underlying RPGs as they were right now. I like the approach of drawing attention to the fact that what's there does work for these programs. So I think that's a really good start. It was, I suppose, looking at this and thinking, we've got a few paragraphs that are being added as implementation guidance in both, and we're only going that next step with illustrative examples in one, which is where I think our constituents are going to get real benefit from actually seeing some examples. And it was just that balance of what we were doing here and thinking that our constituents might be looking for a bit more help in the RPG1 area. That's all I was sort of saying. And if you have thought that through and don't think that needs to be done, that's good, because I just wanted to really clarify that that thinking had been done, and we've got a good rationale for not going that extra step with illustrative examples for RPG1. And perhaps we can explain that in the basis of the conclusions, because when this comes out, it's going to look a little bit unbalanced. We've sort of got some paragraphs in one, and we've got paragraphs and illustrative examples to help our constituents in the other. So I think we just need to, if we have worked that through and made this conscious decision not to go to the illustrative examples, alongside RPG1, to be very clear about why we don't think that that is needed, or it's too hard, or whatever the reasons are. I think it would be helpful for our constituents to explain that.
Thanks, Todd. I think that's helpful to understand. And one of the challenges I think we do have is that the examples, okay, the tax expenditures is in addition, but the examples that we're proposing for RPG3 actually address each of the three dimensions within RPG1 in terms of how you would model it and bring the financial impact in. So I think what we do need to do, as you say, is communicate that within the material that we add to RPG1. So in a sense, the underlying detail, you need to look at RPG3. So we just need to think how we actually address that. So Ross, if you can take that away as an action. And then I'll go to Lynn, then Mike, Lindy and Renee in that order. So Lynn, to you, thanks for waiting.
That's fine. So mine is building on the communication point. I don't disagree with anything in these papers, but I'm not sure we've got the communication of the positioning right, and I don't think we should leave that communication to things that go alongside the actual document, the exposure draft itself. Just picking up on a couple of points. So we are saying that we've reviewed and we've ought to make more of this, that we've reviewed these and think that these are really relevant and would encourage widespread adoption. I think in doing so, we should reassure our constituents that if they do adopt these, we're not about to go and change them again once we do further work. So, because you might get a response of, well, hold on, I might hold off. If I'm not adopting now, I might continue to hold off adopting until further work is done. So I think the positioning of, actually, we've done this work, we've added this guidance, and we encourage adoption, because that is not going to, we don't see that changing in the future, I think is an important message. And I think the other message for me is actually that we're not going further at this stage, but the stage we have got to in this won't change. And I think that's an important message. We could arguably have gone further at this stage, but that would be preempting the consultation paper that we've put out there on sustainability. So I do think that communication should come in this document as a standalone document. I don't think we should have, I think we can reinforce it with separate communications, but I think our constituents should pick up one document and understand the position. So I think it needs more narrative at the front to do that.
Thanks, Lynn. I think those are both helpful points to include, and I think, Ross, when we've got to the round, I think we'll need to think about the balance in terms of what sits where. But certainly, it certainly does make me feel that we need to explain this properly in the basis for conclusions. And there's something about also how we orient it in the document as well, but certainly basis for conclusions, I think those are important points. So Mike, to you, then to Lindy, then Renee.
Thank you very much. I have a general comment on the title of that guideline. When I looked into the guideline, the title and the content, I remembered a little bit the situation we had when we in the first round discussed the sustainability consultation paper, because there we have that term sustainability on the one hand, and later on it's named green program, and then a mix of green program and sustainability program. And therefore I would propose, or we should consider, to define that, what green programs mean for the scope of that guideline, and that would, to my mind, also be helpful that we rename the title reporting green sustainability program information, just to manage expectations. That's a very narrow sense of sustainability. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Good points in terms of consistency. Lindy, and then Renee, and then back to you, Ross.
Thank you very much. So, I mean, certainly I agree that this exercise is around creating awareness of the RPGs and how they can be applied for this for sustainability. So I think that's important, and also on the communication aspects, you say, well, we're giving this now, but it doesn't mean that we might not add additional guidance later as well. I don't think we should open up the RPG to amend it, but I think this is actually just the start. So first round, creating awareness, and I think also it's still evolving. The reporting is evolving, so I think it would be really difficult for us to give guidance specifically on RPG 1, how you would do it. Perhaps, I don't know if you would ask it in the consultation process. Maybe we ask for jurisdictions to share their examples with us, or if they are doing it, that we could maybe look at going forward, or maybe that's something we do on the back end of this. But I do think it is very difficult for us to give a lot more examples at this stage. I think we're just creating awareness, and it would be on our program going forward, and there would be opportunity to add additional ones going forward. I don't think this is the last time we would look at examples in this space, because it is now going to be a program of the board. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. I mean, I think there's a number of broader points you've raised there, and certainly some of this I think we're going to be covering in the forum in terms of, as we go forward, we're going to need to think about our mechanisms for getting user feedback on our material, and then thinking about processes for where there are gaps that we need to fill and so on. And I think, you know, your point as well about do we go further and so on, I think we need to balance that with some of the comments that Lynn was making in terms of providing reassurance that we're not going to suddenly come back and pull the rug from under people, if I use a colloquial term. So I think we do need to think quite carefully about that. I think there's one point I was going to make, which is if board members or TAs are aware of particularly good examples of green programs in their own jurisdictions at the moment, it would certainly be helpful to have that, because what we don't want to do is add a lot of examples, but actually we do want to make sure that the fact patterns actually are realistic. And we've certainly had offers to help from OECD, but I think if you're aware of particularly good generic types of schemes within your jurisdiction, please, if you can let Ross know urgently on those, and then we can use those to develop the implementation examples. So Renee, to you, and then back to you, Ross, to comment on the points members have raised.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think that some members touched on my comment. Lynn, I think. So when I looked at the draft material, I was expecting more of a background section at the front to position the work we're doing here in the broader context of the other initiatives that we have, or the journey that we're on, to position this, as a first step, articulating the purpose of what we're trying to do here, to raise awareness. But this is not the end of it in itself, and not to preempt the decision we will be making, but clarifying, I think, the background, explaining more of the story, why we're doing this, and where does it fit in the bigger context of other proposals that we have. I'm trying to position myself later in time. So this is my comment. Now I'm reflecting, and I just want to share my reflection with board members. It doesn't impact here, but I'm trying to position myself later when we're looking at the IPSASB draft standard, and particularly the first one on general disclosure. And I'm trying to figure out and map out in my head, how is the guidance here going to interact or work with or create tension with the guidance. And maybe it's more than guidance, it will be authoritative guidance in this new sustainability standard. And I don't know, this is still something that I'm trying to figure out, but positioning myself in the future, I'm trying to understand if that's helping me clarify what I would want to communicate in this document. And so anyway, I think my main point at this point is it needs to be better positioned with some more background upfront. And I reinforce, I think, Lynn's comment on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. I think that's really helpful, that perspective. Ross, to you, just to respond, I think you can clearly hear that a lot of this is around positioning, communication, and not prejudging what comes next. But to you on the specifics.
Yeah, no, I think, Renee, I take your point and Lynn's point on the communication and, making sure our constituents follow the story and how this fits with everything else we're thinking of doing down the road with sustainability, and how to position that right in the document. Maybe leave that one with me, and I'll think about it. It's a little bit non-traditional that we explain to that level, but I can see the rationale for it. I just have to think about the right way to do it. Because I think from our position, at least on our side, I think we're clear on what the narrative is, but you're right, our constituents need to understand that. So yeah, that is a gap at the moment, but we'll address that for September. Mike, your comment on the title of the document and the use of green programs and kind of the consistency point there, I think that's one I'd just like to take away and think about a little bit, and how to address that appropriately. I don't think it's a major hurdle, but I take your point, and I think let's just make sure the title makes sense with what we're doing, and that how we describe green programs or whatever we call them is consistent with the way people are thinking about it and how it works. So if okay, I'll take that one away rather than trying to give you an answer on that today and bring that back in September.
Okay, thanks, Ross. I mean, I think, you know, listening to what you've just said and listening to what members have said, it sounds to me as though we do need probably a common preamble, which might sit in the basis for conclusions in terms of explaining the detail. But I think it probably needs to be reasonably common between the two documents so that you can pick either one up and still see the same story and the same conclusions up front. I think, you know, so I think if you can reflect how we might do that, but I think it does seem to me we need to be consistent. We need to have that thinking, you know, certainly in basis for conclusions. I think within the constraints of how we operate and how the material is drafted, we then need to think about, is there something that kind of flags this up front, you know, so that wherever you get into this, you kind of get the, you know, you get directed to where the thinking actually is, and you see the, you see that context. And then I think there is the point about making sure that we bridge between RPG 1 and RPG 3 in terms of the context and so on. And I thought also Renee's points about future proofing probably particularly apply to the sort of programs, thinking about those in RPG 3, where clearly you've got the model, the TCFD model, but also the one that, you know, that sits behind the IPSASB in terms of governance, strategy, risks, metrics, and we just need to be a bit more explicit about how that, if you like, there's consistency with that. So I think it probably is doable, but it just needs some clear thinking to address those points from members. And then there's a broader communication context as well, but we can maybe think about that as well. Okay. So I think that's brought out some very useful points on positioning and so on, and how we think about the documents, how we communicate. So Ross, do you want to just talk a bit about the document, the draft document itself, and just to emphasise to members, we're not looking for detailed drafting points, but it would be great to get additional feedback. So Ross, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Before that, I just wanted to confirm one of the other points on the slide that I won't go through now, but I do think all these instructions are doable for September. So my intention is still to bring back a document for review and approval in September by the board. So I'll take forward these instructions and action them, and you'll see that in the worked up ED that will be presented to the board in September with the hope for approval. And Ian, do we want to do project timeline first and then we can flip to the document?
Yeah, if you want to.
Yeah. Thanks. So yeah, the last point on the slide that I wanted to address was in the project. I've given an overview project timeline. I just wanted to confirm that members are okay with me adding that to the work program. We can defer that decision to wait until September if we want to have the ED in that, but I did think at the moment we're not indicating any forward time frame for this project because we haven't had this discussion. So having had this discussion, my proposal is that I add it to the work program and that, you know, we intend to move forward on that timeline. So with that, I'll stop and pause for discussion on that point. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. I think there's in putting it on there, we recognise there is a decision that the board will take on the exposure period in September, as previously agreed. So it would be contingent on that. But a member's consent that we do put it on the present it on the work programme. Okay, that's good. I see thumbs up to that. So thanks for that confirmation. Okay, so Ross, then into the document itself.
Yeah, so on the document itself, you know, I think happy to maybe take comments, if any, on a section by section basis. I think we've already got quite a few comments that I need to reflect, so I don't think we need to go through those ones again if but if there's any specific comments, and obviously if there's any edit comments, we don't need to discuss those. If you send those to me offline, I'll make sure I look at them with all the other edits I'm getting and receive for the September version. So I guess if we go start from the request for comments, I do have 2 SMCs in there, but those aren't final SMCs, so I'm not asking for review of those now or agreement. We will go through SMCs in September when we look at the document, but I guess if there's any aversion to the SMCs that I have there, let me know, or thoughts, and I'll take that into account in crafting the final SMCs I propose to the board in September. So maybe if we pause on the request for comments.
Yeah, Camira.
Thanks, Chair. I just have a minor comment in the part of the objective of the exposure draft. If we can describe, so in line with what Mike said, if we can define or describe what we mean by green program, that would be helpful. So thanks.
Thanks. I mean, I think we're going to need to be quite careful here, and you know, because I think there are problems with how you just define sustainability reporting. Those came out in the CAG discussion. If we sort of try to talk about green, we're going to get into problems with green. So I think we need some form of description that kind of works, and it may well be that we're better off actually sticking to terminology about sustainability and sustainability reporting rather than green. But I think, you know, so just to set expectations, I don't think we can have a description, we can have a definition that we start to apply here, but I think we need to be consistent and probably in being focusing more on sustainability and sustainability reporting. But Ross, we'll leave you to kind of work that one through. But I think we should only use one or other of those terms rather than a mixture for the reasons members have articulated. Okay, thanks, Camira. Renee, and then Ross moves on.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I am struggling to understand in practical terms what we mean by the last sentence. It's on page 13 of 25. So we're in the section request for comment, where there is a subsection entitled objective of the exposure draft. So there is an objective stated there. And then there's also the objective on page 15 of 25, which is numbered paragraph number 1. But if I come back to the first paragraph on page 13, the last sentence says that so that the broader financial information can be used for both financial reporting and for other purposes, including budget purposes. And I am struggling to try to understand how is this useful? And I'm thinking maybe our constituents will too. So I'm pointing this out. I don't know if we need to try to further articulate what we mean here. So additional information could be used for decision making. It is additional financial reporting that will be produced, I suppose, as a result of this guidance. But to produce financial information that is useful and can be used for financial reporting, it is financial. I'm just struggling with that statement. I think that maybe we need to try to consider how we could articulate it better.
Thanks, Renee. I think that's helpful and probably what we should do rather than, you know, iterate on drafting at the moment. But I think your point on consistency, firstly, between what's on page 13 and 15 is valid. And probably if we pick up more of the language in the framework in terms of this area, that's probably better. And the suggestion around decision making certainly sounds helpful in that context because it's language that we use in the framework. So I think if we go back to that, that should help us step through this. Okay, Ross. So if we move on to the subsequent section.
Yeah, so the next section would be the actual paragraph on objective, but I think based on Renee's comment, we already need to look at that. So unless there's other comments, and I see David's got his hand up.
Yeah, David.
Thanks, Ian. I mean, I would agree with Renee's point that we may need to make sure that pages 13 and 15 are consistent, but I was also reflecting on the point that Mike had made and various others about comms, and I was wondering whether this page could actually be used to address some of those issues. And I was thinking too that if you look at the sort of the paper itself and talking about how this project arose and is sort of linked with the OECD's green budgeting, I just wonder whether there's actually something in the OECD's paper that we could quote with attribution, obviously, which might help meet Mike's point. So I think there could be some sort of careful drafting and sort of links between the two, which might actually help on the comms side, because that is important. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Camira.
Yes, just a minor comment. I would suggest not referring to non-authoritative. So the word non-authoritative, because if the RPGs are already non-authoritative, referring again non-authoritative guidance to the RPGs is like a bit redundant. And also it will help us to position better the guidance, because people will be interested in seeing what is there. And so I think it will be more like a communication strategy there. Thanks.
Thanks, Camira. Probably if we keep motoring on its additional guidance, that's helpful and would help in terms of how we position it. But I agree with you, we don't need to mix the things up there. Okay, good. Move us on then, Ross.
Yes, so the next part where I've actually got drafting is the implementation guidance examples for RPG1, and that's on page 7 of 1.3.1.
Yeah, Claudia. Claudia, to you first, and then to Camira.
So now you can hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. My point is, I'm a little bit confused by the language of the question. I think when I go to the scope of the RPG, it says the scope of this RPG1 includes an entity's projected flows. So it's not a question, can I integrate the impact of green programs in this RPG1 if I have projected in or outflows out of these green programs I have to integrate in this RPG1. And all of the questions or the guidance have this sound that seems to me a little bit it's optional if they would like to bring this information in this RPG1 or not. And I would be happy if we could be a little bit more precise when we have such in and outflows and we want to use RPG1 as a total, then we have to include it.
Yeah. Thanks, Claudia. Ross, do you want to just come back on that? Because that does sound like a very, we've got those sorts of examples elsewhere in our literature where, it's if you do this, then you should. And maybe that's the sort of line that we need to think a little bit more about. Ross?
Yeah, I mean, I think the questions are basically to help people understand what they should be putting in. So maybe it's just the phrasing of the question that we can tweak a little bit. Let me take that one away, but the feedback we've received is the questions are helpful, but if the phrasing makes it feel like it's optional, you can pick which you include and not include, we should definitely look at it, because I think clearly when we looked at the models, it was if you are creating these green programs, you should include the cash inflows and outflows in your RPG1 assessment. So it was more dealing with the problem that we have at the moment is people aren't using RPG1 and aren't seeing sustainability in it. So I think there's maybe some phrasing we can look at that will help deal with Claudia's point.
Okay, thanks, Ross. So to Camira and then to Lindy.
Thanks. On the first implementation guidance, I was thinking when I took a look to the RPG1, I saw that there are two terms that are really important. That is capacity and vulnerability. I was wondering if we can somehow address those terms in the context of green program and sustainability. And on the second IG, I see that the direction that we are going, okay, what is the impact of green programs on the dimensions? But actually I was thinking on the other way around. So how the three interrelated dimensions, service, revenue, and debt, can impact in the execution and development of green programs. I think that that perspective should also be taken into account. Thanks.
Thanks, Camira. I think that's really helpful to remind us about that. And that may well help us as well with a bridge into RPG3 as well. Lindy.
Thank you very much. Agree with what Camira said. I think also we just need to look at, I said we shouldn't change the RPG, but we need to look at paragraph 4 of RPG1, because it says it does not directly address issues associated with reporting on environmental sustainability. So maybe we just strike that or amend it.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, that Ross and I did have a discussion about. And I think it comes back into the, when we drafted RPG1, there was quite a strong push from a number of constituents to get us into broader sustainability reporting. And that was what that was intended to forestall, that this was the financial impacts. And I think we just need to actually, again, reiterate that this is about putting the financial perspective. Non-financial information is, of course, relevant, to estimating the financial impacts, and we just need to get that clarity. So it's probably not that we need to amend that paragraph, but that we just need to actually make sure that in picking up, we set that context, if you like. Ross, back to you.
Yeah, and agree with that. I think, Ian, we did have that back and forth on what to do with paragraph 4, and I think you convinced me that it's more about the impact financially rather than the sustainability stream. And I think this probably goes to that broader comms point that Lynn started earlier, that we need to kind of sew it all together, that this is using our current financial information guidance, and that broader sustainability and bigger changes to our literature will come through the bigger project that we're talking about through advancing public sector sustainability. With that, I propose we move on. And the next section is the RPG3 implementation guide and examples that are on page 9 of 1.3.1. There's two IGs there.
So not seeing any hands raised. I think, a lot of the commonality, the points that we've made already kind of ripple through. Certainly that request to members and TAs, if you do have good jurisdictional examples of programs that we can pick up to use as the basis for the fact patterns in IEs, that would be really helpful.
Thanks. And then the last point, and there's not drafting yet, as I'm planning the 4 IEs that I've outlined on page 10 of 1.3.1. And as Ian said, grateful if anyone has any examples they've come across in their work of any of these, please share with me. We will be spending some significant time between now and September getting those ready. So happy for any input or engagement from members, TAs on this.
Good. Okay. And as we've said, specific pieces of detailed drafting, please do pass those through to Ross. I think that's been a good discussion. I think probably just the sort of guidance that we were looking for from the board in terms of those steers, those bigger picture comments, those thoughts on how we partly stitch this into our existing guidance, but also thinking about the communication and so on. So I think that's been a very good discussion. So thanks everyone for those points. Ross, anything else you need before we move on to item 2?
No, nothing more for me other than thanks again. I agree with your comments, Ian. That's very helpful input. So I appreciate everybody taking the time and sharing their thoughts.
Good. Okay. So with that, we move into item 2 on the agenda, which is the revenue capital transfer examples. Edwin, you've made a number of amendments responding to the discussion that the board had in June. So over to you in terms of introducing the item.
Thanks, Ian. Let me share my slides. Okay. Okay, so just one paper this time on the revenue capital transfer examples, as Ian said. And essentially, this paper just addresses the instructions from June to essentially rework the examples to only change one variable at a time. So before I jump into the examples, I did get a question from a board member before the meeting asking if there will be examples on whether an arrangement is a binding arrangement or not. And that issue will not be covered in these 4 examples, but staff will plan to have an IG on that topic. And in fact, in the September meeting, staff will plan to bring a listing of topics where we want to draft IGs, and we will discuss that with the board. So without further delay, I'll go to the first example. So this is really the base case that was discussed in June. And in this example, the binding arrangement specifies that the entity gets 22 million upfront to construct a building of unspecified use. And in this case, the entity has determined that there is only one compliance obligation, which is construction of the building. So upon receipt of the funds, because there is an unfulfilled compliance obligation, the entire 22 million is deferred, and it is recorded as deferred revenue, which is a liability. And as the building is being constructed, that's when the deferred revenue will be decreased and recognized as revenue. So nothing really controversial in this example, but I'll pause here to see if there are any reactions from board members. Oops.
Thanks, Edwin. So never say never in terms of uncontroversial. Okay. I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I think on the base case, sorry, Lucy.
Oh.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Edwin, for the presentation. I actually concur in the minor update in example 1 from the June paper. However, I noted that as mentioned in example 2, example 2 is built or is developed based on example 1. I suggest improvement in paragraph in example 1, wherein the allocation of the 22 million funds to be provided by entity B to entity A, as discussed in, which was discussed in paragraph 1A under example 2, should at the onset be indicated in paragraph 1A in example 1. And therefore, I suggest that paragraph 1A under example 1 should be revised as follows just to mention at the onset on the composition of the 22 million, which is based on the budgeted construction cost of 20 million and overhead cost of 2 million instead of related costs, just to be consistent with the paragraph in example 2. I also suggest that the construction period of 5 years, which is mentioned in paragraph 1D, should also be cited in the first sentence in paragraph 1B, 1B, because it has been referred to in paragraph 1B. And the others are minor edits in the examples, but in paragraph 1D, I would like to suggest that the entity should also has to return entity B the funds that have not been spent on the construction of the building and overhead costs. So because right now it's only on the funds that have not been spent on construction. So I would like to suggest that we have to be specific, that the funds to be returned by entity A to entity B should be funds that had not been spent on construction of the building, including the overhead costs. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. So I think your point is well made in terms of absolute consistency in the wording between the two. Edwin, did you want to pick up on any of the substantive points here? I mean, what I do not want to do is, if we're content with the accounting and this is consistency, I don't want to re-deliberate that. I think we need to just get the fact pattern exactly right. Edwin, to you.
Yeah, I can certainly make those changes to make sure the two examples are consistent. So I can do that in the next draft.
Okay, all right. Tricia.
Thank you. I agree with the proposed examples, but in my view, the paragraph 1D in example 1 confused me about what is the compliance obligation. Is the construction completion or state completion? Because in the second part of the paragraph 1G, seems that there is an asset in each state of the construction. My suggestion, I think it's not necessary to understand the example, the paragraph 1G. My suggestion is to delete or to rewrite this paragraph. Thank you.
Thanks, Tricia. So Edwin, I think on that.
Yeah, I can work with Patricia to revise 1D and also incorporate Leslie's comments from earlier.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. Any other points on example 1? Okay, so then we move on to example 2.
Okay. Okay, so in this example, the binding arrangement has now been, I guess, updated to cover both construction and operation of the asset. And specifically in the example, it talks about operating the building as a library for a period of 10 years. So in addition to the terms from example 1, there's now an additional 10 million that is given to entity A, and that 10 million is meant to subsidize the operation of the library over 10 years. So the entity has concluded that there's now two compliance obligations, one for construction of the building and one for operation of the building as a library. So in terms of the accounting, the compliance obligation for construction of the building is the same as example one. So you would defer upfront and then recognize as you build the building. And in terms of operation of the building, because at the onset, when you get the initial 10 million, you haven't done any of it yet, it would be similar in that you would defer the $10 million or 10 million upon receipt. And as you're operating the library, you would actually recognize that as revenue over time. And one comment that I received from a member prior to the meeting is technically, when you look at the draft revenue standard, you're supposed to look at the individual activities if possible. And in this case, the comment was that the example should specify that because there is no real practical way to look at every single activity that goes into what is considered operation of the building, really the best proxy of recognizing revenue in this case is really by using a essentially straight line method where you recognize the revenue over the 10-year period. So, so I can certainly update the examples to state that in the analysis. So in terms of the return obligation, there is no accounting for it if the library is being operated. But if it ever happens that the entity decides to stop operation of the library, then essentially they have to reverse the initial entry and record a repayment of cash. So it's just a reversal of the deferred revenue and a credit to cash. And this entry is only booked when it decides or when it actually ceases operation of the library within the 10-year period. So I'll stop there now to see if there are any comments from board members.
Thanks, Edwin. So I open up for comments. Yeah, Camira, then Lindy, and then Lisa.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Edwin. I just had a minor question in the footnote, because you recognize that there are some complex scenarios where there is no information, no segregation of how the costs are divided between construction, operation, and so on, and that this staff was considering to draft additional implementation guidance. So I will just support this idea to help preparers at least to have a better understanding of how they can allocate these costs between construction and operation when there is no information in the binding arrangement. Thanks.
Thanks. I'll take comments from Lindy and Lucy and then back to you, Edwin.
Thank you very much. And my comment is on, sorry, did I jump the gun? Oh, sorry. My comment is
well, at least we haven't heard your comment yet, Lindy, so but you're it's your slot now anyway.
The 10 million deferred revenue, I think it probably is very unlikely that you're going to get the 10 million up front. Over 10, you know, that you can use over a 10 million period. I wouldn't mind getting such a deal, but I wondered if we should explain that, and I agree with the comment that you got offline. I wonder if you should explain that, well, you could either get a certain amount over the period of time, so maybe 1 million upfront, and then you would defer that, or you get it at the end of the year, at the end of each financial period, and then you would have revenue and a receivable until you get the liability at the end. I don't know if that's not overcomplicating it, but I did wonder if you would have cases where the 10 million would be received upfront. And I don't think even it would be a case that the 10 million would be receivable upfront. I'm not sure.
I mean, I think on this we need to be careful to split between what we're trying to explain in terms of the accounting treatment versus, you know, whether this might not happen in practice. So I think we just need to be quite careful about how specific we get. because otherwise we're going to multiply the number of the examples quite considerably. And people can always find different facts to fit the circumstances. Ross, did you want to come in quickly before I go to Lustvi and then Lynn?
Yeah, I just wanted to illustrate that. So these examples aren't meant to copy every iteration of what might include or be a representation of what people might see in their fact patterns, because the iterations that exist in practice are probably quite substantial, but it is meant to illustrate key concepts in the model. And the key concept here is, if we're talking about the capital portion and there's also an operating portion embedded in that, you need to separate them and account for them separately. So I think that example does this very clearly, and I would be careful to tinker with it too much, or we're not going to be giving clarity on the difference that people need to separate their operating grants from their capital grants. And take your point, Lindy, it's probably not going to be 10 million upfront. It's probably going to be a number of appropriations over a number of years. But there's a risk if we get too complicated on explaining what we think is a very practical appropriation for an operating grant, and that people might lose the clarity that you need to separate your capital from your operating. And again, to the problem we've had when we discussed this in the past, is people mix the two in the accounting for the capital grant. And because there's an operating portion, they're going to defer the recognition of the capital grant over the period of the operating grant, and we want to separate the two clearly. So that's why the fact pattern is as it is.
Thanks, Ross. So to Lustvi and then to Lynn.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Edwin. I actually agree with the revision in example 2. However, for clarity and in relation to paragraph 1C, I think it should be indicated in paragraph 1A that the 10 million subsidy is intended to cover 1 million per year of the cost of operating the building as a public library for the first 10 years, instead of using the word sum. I also think there is a need for cleaning up in the draft example on the manner of determining the revenue that should be recorded, that should be recognized as provided in example 1 and example 2. In example 1, paragraph 4, specifically, we refer to percentage of construction completed that will be used to determine the revenue to be recognized. And it was mentioned that it is also based on the cost incurred in completing the activities. It was mentioned that the cost incurred in completing the activities shall be the basis in determining the percentage of construction completed. On the other hand, in example 2, specifically in the second sentence, paragraph 3, it was mentioned that the basis of recognition is the construction progress determined by the direct construction cost incurred. It seems that direct construction cost incurred and cost incurred as basis for percentage of completion method are actually the same. Also, the percentage of construction completed and construction progress may mean also the same. So for consistency and to avoid confusion or misinterpretation in the method of determining the basis for revenue recognition, I suggest that we use similar terminologies. And finally, while we understand that the examples deal with the revenue recognition, I suggest that, again, for clarity, in the second sentence in paragraph 3, we mentioned that what is to be recognized is revenue, because it is silent. It is silent. It's stated that entity A then recognizes the 22 million over the construction period based on the percentage of construction completed. So just have to be specific that what is to be recognized is already the revenue based on the percentage construction completed. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. I'm going to take comments from Lynn, Todd, and then Liang before I go back to Edwin.
Thanks, Ian. So I don't disagree with any of the examples in these papers, given the fact patterns set out in the papers. I've got a question mark in my mind over how many examples we're going to end up with in the IPSAS as illustrative examples, and I haven't got my head around, are we just debating these now and then we will refine and shrink the number of examples we end up with in the standard, or is it intended that all of these four go in the standard? I do agree with Lindy's point that in my experience, it's not always that you get the transfer up front. For capital transfers, in my experience, there's quite often scenarios where you have to start constructing the asset and then claim back the money you're due. So if we are going to end up with multiple examples, I would encourage us to have an example where you don't get the money up front somewhere. But I do think we need to, once we've bottomed these and once we've bottomed everything else we're doing on drafting, take a hard look at the number of illustrative examples that we're going to end up with in the revenue standard. When we exposed previously, we did a look at all the IFRS 15 examples and then said, is there a reason for deleting them for public sector purposes? And we still ended up with a lot of examples. I do think we ought to be looking again at a more high level perspective after we've nailed these as to what are the right illustrative examples we should have in the final standard we're proposing, because I think we could be overloading it too much with non-public sector specific ones or ones that aren't necessarily demonstrating a principle that we need an example on.
Thanks, Lynn. I think that's a very good point, and I know that staff are going to bring a paper on that in September. And I entirely agree with you. I think we have to think about the balance between what we've got in authoritative, then IGs, and then use the IEs in a way that actually clearly explains for constituents what's going on. And we do need to be very careful about not having too many examples, but recognising that there may be an elaboration that we explain at some stage about how does a timing over the receipt impact, and but just be very deliberate that we don't do that again and again and again, because that would obscure. So there will be a paper from staff for September on that. Todd and then Liang.
Thanks, Ian. I just wanted to sort of register that I'm reasonably comfortable with the examples. I think it's important that we do sort of step back and think why we need the examples. And I suppose listening to the conversation, the way I see it, example one's really helpful for setting a base case. If we are concerned that when we end up with two compliance obligations, which example 2 is essentially trying to outline that something might change, then it's helpful to have example 2, because example 2 is saying you separate and you still do the same accounting for the construction of the asset versus the other compliance obligation and how you account for that. So I can see how it can be helpful in terms of distinguishing. One thing that I do agree with, which I think has come up from others, is we do have to be careful with the language that we use in the examples. And to the extent that we are linking it back to the wording that's going to be sitting in the underlying standard, the better. So getting that idea that there are two compliance obligations and language like that actually helps to link the examples back to what the standard is actually saying.
Thanks, Todd. Liang, to you.
Thanks, Chair. I have a minor comment about paragraph 1C, the second sentence. If entity A stopped operating the building as a library at 2 years into the 10-year period, I think the meaning here is not very clear to me. I think it is intended to say that if entity has operated for 2 years, it can get to 2 million, and if it stopped operating at year 3, it is required to return 8 million. I think this sentence can be improved to make the meaning more clear. Thank you.
Thanks, Liang. Renee, and then I'll go back to Edwin.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just want to reinforce the importance of additional implementation guidance or illustrative examples in the scenarios noted in footnote 3 to example 2. I think that example 2 is a very straightforward black and white scenario where we're expecting that the arrangement will be allocating 2 amounts to the 2 obligations. I think that in practice, and what stakeholders would find useful, is when it is not clear, as is stated in footnote 3. So when I saw footnote 3, I was very pleased that we're going to be addressing that gray area, that the lack of clarity in a binding arrangement, and to what extent that a lack of clarity may actually disqualify an arrangement from being a binding arrangement, because you need specificity. So I'm going to leave it at that, but to me, I'm expecting and I'm looking forward to what's going to be produced, because to me, that's that guidance that will be very useful for those cases where there's a lack of clarity in how the agreements were written. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. So I think we're seeing the tension here between we need to identify what the principles are and what guidance is needed to clarify those, and the need to avoid ending up being too prescriptive and writing rules. And ultimately, I think what we're going to need to do, and people will need to be clear about this, that if the language that is entered into does not actually meet the requirements to be enforceable, then actually it's not a binding arrangement. And that is going to be the consequence. Now, there is always going to be judgment here, and that is why we focused on what is enforceable rather than sufficiently specific and language like that early on. So I think we do need to be very, very careful. And, you know, frankly, if it's not enforceable, then that means it's not a binding arrangement. So I think there's a balance here. But then I think back to Lynn's portion, and I think to Todd's as well, we should be clear about when we introduce an implementation example, what is the specific principle that it's trying to explain and provide further guidance on. And it needs to very clearly build off the language that is used elsewhere in the standard. And I think that's probably a general, something general that underpins a lot of the comments members have made. We need to be very, very careful about use of terminology and what that means. And that's certainly where I think you know, it's helpful getting comments from members whose native language is not English, because I think you tend to get those inconsistencies picked up. Edwin, any particular points you want to make on that?
No, I think you've already addressed how I was going to respond, but yeah, we will have a closer look and make sure all the wording is consistent. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. And I think probably if you can tighten up the wording along the lines that members have asked for, and then I would suggest that you recirculate the examples among those members that have expressed comments to make sure that you've actually adequately picked up their comments. So if you can do that out consumption, that'd be really helpful. And then there is this general paper that will come back for September, which will look, where we'll start to look at what's required in terms of both IGs and IEs for standard. Okay, so move us on then to example 3, Edwin.
Okay. Okay, so example 3 is building on examples 1 and 2, and in this scenario, there's now an addition of a 5 million penalty if entity A stops operating the building as a library. So in terms of the accounting, I'll just quickly gloss over the construction and operation, because that's essentially the same as examples 1 and 2. For the penalty, so until the entity actually trips up the penalty, there is no accounting, because if they were operating the library in accordance with the terms of the binding arrangement, there would be nothing payable. So where the penalty does come in is if the entity ceases to operate the building as a library during the 10-year period, then the first thing is it will have to repay any of the amount that relates to the 10 million. So that's the same as example 2. And in addition to that, they'll now have to record the additional penalty for 5 million. So the key difference from the June example is I changed the numbers a bit so it doesn't use the same amount. So that was causing a lot of confusion. And it's really specifying in this example now that the penalty is in addition to the obligation to return the funds. Okay. So I'll stop there and get reactions from the board.
Thanks, Edwin. So open up for comments from members. Yep. So I've got Patricia, then Camira.
Thank you. I'm not comfortable with the example because, especially because of the conclusion, paragraph 3, that the entity does not recognize because it is a contingent liability. In my view, the action to stop to operate the construction is in control of the entity. It's a decision of the entity. And if I understand correctly, will you discuss onerous contract in the context of the revenue project? And then I think you need to think in depth about the penalties. Yes, it's my consideration. Thank you.
So I think the example is more about the fact that you can have multiple past events. And it's therefore consistent with how we're proposing to change the conceptual framework on liabilities, because it only gets triggered, there's a second past event when the penalty is triggered. It's only contingent until that point. That's, Edwin, I think that's right, isn't it?
Yeah, I think Patricia's point, though, was more on whether this is really a contingent liability as defined in IPSASB 19. And I think maybe a better way to explain it is that the penalty is not really a present obligation until it is triggered. So rather than using the language that's in the example now, which admittedly is a bit confusing, maybe we should just say that because it's not a present obligation, there is no basis to recognize the liability at all until you trigger that penalty.
Thanks, Evan. I think I saw thumbs up to that and nods that that's obviously helpful, and that would address Trisha's point. Okay, to Camira and then to Lynn.
Thanks, Chair. And yeah, Edwin, I agree with your suggestion. So it's a good way just to remove the word contingent liability and refer directly to the non-existence of present obligation. But still, we can leave the reference, the last sentence that referred to IPSAS 19, that the entity needs to assess if they need to disclose in the future the contingent liability. I also had a minor comment in the paragraph 1B. The first sentence that is really explaining that the penalty will be the return of the transfer related to construction or operation of the asset. I think the construction, we can remove it because we are only referring to returning the 10 million. So then only for clarity, just remove the word construction there. Thanks.
Thanks, Camilla. Lindy?
Thank you very much. It's also on 1B, just to understand that you would then have a liability of 6 million, right? You wouldn't have, because you would take that unearned, that deferral will now be a liability, a financial liability. Okay, just to make sure I understand that. I don't know if you need to explain that, but it was just the wording in the example. And then I also agree on paragraph 3. I don't think we should mix the conceptual framework discussion with IPSAS 19 stuff. I think it causes confusion. So just say that there is no liability until there's a breach, because I'm sure you're not. Yeah, otherwise there's nothing else. Sorry. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. Okay. Edwin, back to you.
Okay, so moving on to example 4. Okay, so this example is not actually a capital transfer, but we just thought we would show an example of a pure operating transfer, just to contrast with the capital transfer examples that we have been talking about. And essentially, it's really stripping out the operating portion of example 2. So in this example, the entity is getting, in this example, the entity is getting 10 million upfront to operate the building for that they already own, and they're asked to operate it as a library for 10 years. So same as example 2, you would defer the 10 million and you would recognize that over time as the building is being operated. And similar to example 2, I did get a comment on how we should clarify that or explain why straight line is the most appropriate proxy for recognition of revenue. So I can add that in to the wording in the next draft. So I'll stop there because there isn't really anything new compared to example 2, and I'll get comments from board members now.
Thanks, Edwin. So comments, please. So I've got Claudia and then Lucy. So Claudia, to you, and then to Lucy.
Oh, I'm sorry, didn't work like I expect. So is there mentioned in this example in the paragraph 2 a sentence that said the 10 millions will be paid upfront? It says just will be paid during the next for the next 10 years. So it's a little bit unclear what we mean.
Thanks, Claudia. I'll take Lucy and then Todd, and then back to you, Edwin.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Edwin. As mentioned in paragraph 5 of the agenda paper, example 4 is an example of an operating transfer to contrast the accounting with revenue from capital transfers. However, as also mentioned by Edwin, the fact pattern in example 4 is merely a basic reiteration of the fact situations under example 2 pertaining to the operation of the building. And basically, the difference in the fact pattern in example 4 from the portions of the fact patterns in example 2 and 3 is that the transfer in example 4 is solely as a subsidy of entity B to entity A for the operation of the existing building of entity A. It does not show actually any contrast in the accounting for revenue between operating transfer and capital transfer. Considering that the agenda paper pertains to capital transfer examples, I suggest that we delete example 4 under these capital transfer samples. Now, in connection with the Lindy's and Lynn's comments on the release of the release of funds may not be upfront, I suggest that we include an example on multi-year capital transfer wherein funds are released to an implementing entity in tranches over the period of the binding arrangement. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. Todd, to you, and then back to Edwin.
It was interesting to just reflect on example 4 sort of standalone, and I recollect through a lot of the conversations that we've had around sort of the accounting for revenue. I can remember a specific conversation around transfers with sort of time requirements, and how transfers with time requirements, we didn't necessarily want to account for the time requirements by deferring revenue. And it was when I was reflecting just on this example 4, I think I agree with where we've got to here. And it's because we are now starting very much from a, have we got a binding arrangement or have we not got a binding arrangement? And I just thought it was helpful to just reflect on that, given some of the conversations we've had through our journey to arrive at a final revenue standard, that this could sort of be seen to be bringing sort of that time requirement into the deferral of revenue, but I think it is appropriate in the context of a binding arrangement, and it's thinking about all of the things that you need to make sure that you've got a binding arrangement. So there needs to be some level of specificity, it needs to be enforceable, and you would expect that there is, as part of that arrangement, some mechanisms to be able to monitor or understand that you are getting what you've provided the funding for. So in that sort of context, I think this does make sense, but it was just that reflection, given sort of some of the earlier discussions and sort of where we've got to now, but just wanted to reflect the fact that I think this as an example does work. I agree with other comments that perhaps this isn't needed if we're just talking about examples around capital transfers, but it was interesting to reflect on, and I think it is appropriate where that accounting has ended up, given where we're at now in our thinking.
Thanks, Todd. I think you and I having been along a longer journey than some of the other members, can certainly reflect that, and that's a benefit, if you like, of the model that we've arrived at, and without creating too much emphasis on it, probably is helpful to reflect that somewhere in our thinking, that the model does address that now, because you're right, it has been a vexed question both in the framework and in the revenue accounting. Liang, to you, and then back to you, Edwin, to wrap up.
Thanks, Chair. I'm also thinking whether it is necessary for us to keep example 4, because it looks like that example 4 may be a bit straightforward. So one option, as Lucy just raised, we can simply delete this example. Or another approach that we can take, maybe we can change this example 4 as example 2, because example 1 we discussed about the capital transfer related to construction, and as example 2 we discussed about capital transfer related to operation. Then we combine the first 2 examples together as we discussed about the transfer related to construction and operation. Then the last example, we plus the penalty. So in this order, it may be looks more logical, or we can say it is kind of a step by to state this 4 example. That's my suggestion. Thank you.
Thanks, Liang. Edwin, back to you.
Yeah, I agree with the comments, and I think we can take example 4 away and think about whether we could really just reflect everything in example 2, and then maybe have a completely separate example to illustrate the point in example 4, which is essentially looking at, I guess, recognition over time, essentially. So we can think about whether we can draft another example to address that. Thinking back to ED70, I think there are already examples that cover this point. So maybe we can rework some of those to make it more public sector specific.
Okay, thanks, Evan. And I think it does come back to actually that being very deliberate about which examples we're using, and that they are actually necessary in addition to IGs in terms of the final standard, that we shouldn't just have IEs for the sake of it. So I think that's really what we need to be very deliberate about. On this point, though, I think we do need to make sure we have some example like this somewhere, precisely for the reason that Todd has explained. So, you know, we'll need to take that step back and take that away in terms of that discussion of IGs and IEs next time round. Okay. But again, I think that discussion has brought out a number of very important points about precision in the use of language, about the precise way the fact patterns are built up, and about whether we need variance, you know, in terms of different funding profiles. I think were some of the key points that came out of that. Edwin, anything else you need from the board at this stage?
No.
Okay. So I think that's good. In terms of the material for the meeting, then, Ross, anything else we need to do in terms of the formal session today?
No, nothing else for the items for discussion today, just a few administrative notes that I'll provide once Leah stops the stream for today's meeting.
Okay, so with that, thank you very much, everyone, in terms of the formal session today. We will, you know, obviously, we have a few weeks now, and then we reconvene in the September meeting in Lisbon. Leah, can you confirm that the streaming has